left of this hail cone.
Monday, we told you about a strange sound echoing for weeks here in Cincinnati. In fact, it is so loud that some people say it's become a quality of life issue for them.
In the last 90 days, America has recorded more simultaneous geological, atmospheric, and wildlife anomalies than any period in the last century. Scientists have no unified explanation, but one ancient text predicted every single one of them, in order. That fact alone should stop you, because this isn't a story about storms. It isn't about flooding seasons or climate reports. This is about a sequence, a pattern that began quietly, in places no one was watching, and then spread. Not like a disaster spreads, not with sirens or breaking news alerts. It spread the way a crack moves through old stone, slowly, silently, until the surface can no longer hold what is building beneath it. Here is what happened. The ground opened in places engineers had certified as stable, not cracked, not shifted, opened. The sky began rotating above open fields, while the grass below stood completely still. Water rose from beneath city streets, without a single rain cloud overhead. And animals, deer, birds, livestock stopped, refused to move, turned away from paths they had used every single day of their lives, as if something invisible had drawn a line they would not cross. Now, here is the part that most people miss. These events did not happen in isolation. They did not scatter randomly across a map. They followed a sequence. And that sequence matches something written thousands of years ago with a precision that is difficult to explain away. You are about to see each event laid out, one by one. And by the time this is finished, the question will not be whether these things happened. The question will be what they are pointing to. Because the evidence does not point toward chaos. It points toward something far more deliberate, far more ordered, and far older than anything modern science was prepared to measure. Stay with this, because the first sign did not come from the sky. It did not come from the earth splitting open. It came from something most people dismissed entirely. Rain, falling from a clear blue sky, on ground that was already drying, on communities that had already been told the worst was over. And the timing of that rain? That is where this story begins. The weather reports showed nothing. The radar was clear. And yet, the water kept falling. What was happening in the atmosphere had no modern explanation, but an ancient one existed. And it was uncomfortably specific. It started with rain. Oh, not a storm, not a flood warning, just rain, falling from a sky that had no business producing it. Across several regions of the United States, people who had already lived through weeks of severe weather stepped outside on what should have been a recovery day. The sky was blue, partly cloudy at worst. Radar screens at local weather stations showed nothing approaching. No moisture systems, no pressure drops, no reason whatsoever for what happened next. Water began falling from the sky. Not heavy, not violent, just steady, quiet, misplaced rain, dropping onto soil that had barely begun to dry, landing on crops that had just been replanted, soaking foundations that workers had just finished resetting. And the people standing in it looked up, because something felt wrong. Not dangerous, not terrifying, just deeply, quietly wrong. The rain wasn't the problem. The timing was, and timing, as it turns out, is everything. Weather events happen every day in America. That is not news. What made this different was not the water itself. It was what the water interrupted. Think about what recovery looks like after a major weather disaster. Families return to damaged homes. Contractors begin repairs. Farmers replant fields. Communities exhale. There is a collective belief that the worst chapter has closed, that rebuilding can finally begin. that the sky has moved on. This rain arrived precisely at that moment. Not before the crisis, not during it, after, when defenses were down, when people had stopped watching the sky, when the narrative had already shifted from survival to restoration. That is not how weather systems behave. Weather does not wait for the moment of maximum psychological impact. Weather does not pause while communities begin to hope and then return precisely when that hope takes root. But this did. Meteorologists had explanations. They always do. But the explanations didn't match the pattern. And the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Across affected areas, witnesses described the same experience independently. They were not connected. They did not know each other. They lived in different states, different communities, different circumstances. And yet, the details they reported were nearly identical. Clear sky above, no wind, no temperature drop before the rain began, no darkening on the horizon, just water, appearing as if the atmosphere itself had decided to make a point. Puddles formed on streets that emergency crews had just cleared. Fresh soil that landscapers had spent days stabilizing began to soften again. Progress slowed. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, just enough. Just enough to feel like resistance. Some communities reported the rain returning not once, not twice, but multiple times across a 2-week period, always after recovery efforts had resumed, always from clear skies, always without warning. Now here is where it gets specific. Because this kind of rain that interrupts recovery rather than causing initial destruction has a name in ancient literature. It is not described as punishment. It is described as a signal. The book of Amos, chapter 4, verse 7, records these words, "I withheld rain from one city and sent rain on another. One field had rain, another had none and dried up. Yet you did not return to me." Read that again slowly, because what is being described is not a flood. It is not a drought. It is selective, deliberate, timed rainfall designed to interrupt confidence. Designed to slow human momentum at the exact moment humans believe they have regained control. That passage was written approximately 2,700 years ago, and what it describes is precisely what witnesses across America reported experiencing. Not destruction, interruption. But the rain was only the first signal, because while people were looking up trying to understand the sky, something else was happening. Something they couldn't see. Something they could only feel, and it was coming from directly beneath their feet. There is a difference between a warning and a punishment. Punishment arrives to end something. A warning arrives to redirect something. The rain that fell from clear skies across America did not destroy what communities had rebuilt. It slowed it. It softened it. It introduced just enough resistance to make people pause. And pause is exactly what a warning requires. Not panic, not devastation. A pause, a moment where a person stops what they are doing and asks a question they had not thought to ask before. Why is this still happening? Why now? What is this trying to tell us? Those questions matter, because the answer did not come from the sky. It came from below it. While communities stood in rain that had no meteorological cause, the ground beneath those same communities was preparing its own response, and unlike the rain, this one came with sound. Consider what the sequence looked like from the outside. First, disaster. Then, false recovery. Then, rain that interrupted that recovery from a clear sky. And then, silence. A silence that lasted just long enough for people to begin relaxing again. Just long enough for the conversations about the strange rain to fade. Just long enough for daily life to resume its rhythm. And then, the silence ended. Not with more rain, not with more visible disruption, with a sound, a low, deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A sound the earth itself appeared to be producing, and the animals heard it first. Before a single human being reached for their phone to record it, before a single weather alert was issued, the animals already knew. And what they did next was the clearest signal yet that something beneath the surface had fundamentally changed. It began at night, in rural areas mostly. Places where background noise is low enough that unusual sounds have nowhere to hide. A hum, low and steady, not mechanical, not the rumble of distant traffic, or the vibration of industrial equipment. This was deeper than that, more resonant, the kind of sound that you feel in your chest before your ears fully register it. People stepped outside, looked around, looked up, found nothing. The sky was clear. No aircraft overhead, no construction nearby, or no fault lines known to be active beneath those specific locations. And yet, the sound continued. Geologists were contacted, equipment was deployed, and what the instruments recorded, or more precisely, what they failed to record, made the situation far more unsettling than anyone expected. Here is what made this event different from standard seismic activity. Earthquakes produce measurable signatures. They have a point of origin. They radiate outward in patterns that instruments can trace back to a source. This sound had no traceable origin. Seismic monitors in the affected regions detected slight irregularities. Magnetic field instruments showed minor inconsistencies, but nothing that matched the duration, the depth, or the character of what people were hearing and feeling. The sound was real. The instruments confirmed something was occurring, but the instruments could not explain what. Oh, that gap between confirmed occurrence and unexplained origin is where the unease lived. It wasn't just the sound that troubled researchers, it was what happened around it. In multiple locations, the same detail was reported independently, and it had nothing to do with instruments or readings. The animals reacted before humans did. In every location where the sound was reported, the same behavioral pattern emerged. Dogs lifted their heads from sleep, turned toward no visible threat, and held that position, rigid, alert, focused on something their owners could not perceive. Livestock in open fields moved away from specific areas of ground. Not randomly. They moved away from the same patches, as if something beneath those exact points was communicating a boundary. Birds that had settled for the night lifted suddenly from trees and power lines, not in the panicked scatter of a predator response, in a slow, deliberate departure, as if they had received a signal that the current location was no longer appropriate. Wildlife experts were asked to explain the animal behavior. Their answers were careful, measured, and deeply unsatisfying. Because the behavior pattern didn't match any known threat response, it matched something else entirely. Animal behavior specialists noted that the response pattern being observed was consistent with infrasound detection. Infrasound is sound that exists below the range of human hearing. Frequencies so low that human ears cannot register them, but many animals can. Elephants use infrasound to communicate across vast distances. Whales use it to navigate oceans. Dogs, birds, and many mammals are sensitive to infrasound frequencies that humans are completely deaf to. What this means is straightforward. The sound that humans were hearing, the low resonant hum, was likely only a fraction of what was actually being produced. The animals were responding to the full signal. Humans were only catching the edge of it, which raises a question that no one in the scientific community has fully answered. If what humans heard was only the surface layer of the sound, what was the complete signal? And where exactly was it coming from? Researchers examined every conventional explanation: mining operations, underground gas movement, military testing, atmospheric pressure anomalies, industrial equipment vibration carried through soil over long distances. None of them held. The locations where the sound appeared were not near mining activity. Military sources did not acknowledge relevant operations in those areas. Gas line records showed no unusual movement or pressure events. What remained after every conventional explanation was eliminated was not a satisfying alternative answer. What remained was a question, an open, uncomfortable, unresolved question. And then researchers noticed something about the locations where the sound was strongest. something that connected them to events that had already occurred, something that suggested this was not a random phenomenon, but the second movement of a sequence that had already begun. When the locations of the strongest sound reports were mapped, a pattern emerged. The areas where the hum was most persistent and most clearly felt corresponded to areas that had experienced the most significant ground disruption in the preceding weeks. The same soil that had been stressed, or the same ground that had absorbed the most pressure. The same locations where the misplaced rain had returned again and again. This was not coincidence, layered on coincidence. This was sequence, event building on event, signal following signal, as if the Earth itself was working through a process with stages. The ancient book of Job describes something that stopped researchers familiar with Scripture cold. Chapter 26, verse 11. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his rebuke. The trembling described there does not arrive with destruction. It arrives after the event, as a response, as a continuation, which meant the sound beneath the ground was not the beginning of something. It was the middle of something already in progress. Consider what that means practically. If the rain was signal 1 and the underground sound was signal 2, then the sequence was not finished. There were more stages ahead, and if the pattern held, each stage would be slightly more visible than the last, slightly harder to explain away, slightly more direct in its communication. That is not how random weather events work. Random events do not escalate in clarity. Random events do not build on each other with increasing precision, but warnings do. After the sound faded, the ground did something no one anticipated. It began to heal, and that healing, that apparent restoration, turned out to be the most troubling development yet, because what the ground left behind when it closed was not nothing. It left a record, and that record was written in straight lines. The ground had gone quiet again. The sound had faded. Weather reports returned to normal. Emergency alerts went silent, and slowly life began to return to the affected areas. Farmers reopened fields. Families returned to neighborhoods. Wildlife began appearing at the edges of forests and open land again. At first glance, it looked like recovery. It looked like the natural order restoring itself. It was not. What the animals did when they returned to familiar territory was so consistent across so many different species and locations that wildlife researchers described it using a word they almost never use: unanimous. Deer that had grazed the same meadows for years returned to the edge of those meadows and stopped. They did not graze. They stood at the boundary of familiar ground and looked into it, as if the territory they had always known had become a territory they needed to evaluate from a distance. Birds returned to power lines and rooftops, but they did not settle. They landed, paused, and lifted again, repeatedly, as if the ground below them was failing some test they were quietly running. Livestock released onto land certified as safe by agricultural inspectors refused to move past certain points. No fence, no obstacle, no visible reason, just a line only they could perceive. Farmers who had worked with animals their entire lives described the behavior as unlike anything they had seen. Not fear, not confusion, something more unsettling than either of those things: certainty. The animals seemed completely certain that something was present that humans could not detect. Wildlife cameras set up to monitor recovery in affected areas captured footage that researchers found difficult to categorize. Nocturnal animals that should have been active moved instead in tight, cautious patterns, stopping frequently, lifting their heads, orienting towards specific patches of ground with focused attention, then moving away. In several locations, animals were documented avoiding water sources they had used reliably for years, not because the water was visibly contaminated. Testing confirmed the water was clean. The animals simply would not approach it. One wildlife researcher made an observation that circulated quietly among colleagues. The avoidance patterns of different species in the same area were overlapping. meaning deer, birds, and smaller mammals were all avoiding the exact same ground, independently, without coordinating, as if they were all reading the same signal from the Earth itself. Yet, there is a well-documented phenomenon in geological research called animal precognition related to seismic events. Before earthquakes, animals frequently display unusual behavior: agitation, sudden movement away from an area, refusal to enter spaces they normally occupy without hesitation. This behavior is thought to be connected to their sensitivity to infrasound, electromagnetic field changes, and subtle ground vibrations that precede seismic activity by hours or even days. The behavior observed in affected American regions matched this pattern almost exactly, with one critical difference. No seismic event followed. The animals behaved as if one was coming, as if the ground was preparing to do something, and then nothing happened. At least nothing that instruments could record, which left researchers with two possibilities. Either the animals were responding to a false signal, something that mimicked seismic precursors without being one, or the event the animals were anticipating was not seismic at all. It was something instruments were not designed to detect. Farmers in affected regions began keeping detailed records of animal behavior after the initial events. What those records revealed over a period of weeks was a pattern with a rhythm. The unusual behavior would increase for a period of 1 to 3 days, then subside, then increase again, not randomly, in cycles, as if whatever the animals were responding to was itself operating on a schedule, appearing, receding, and returning with a regularity that felt deliberate rather than chaotic. The cyclical nature of the animal responses lined up with something else researchers had been tracking. The same areas where animal behavior peaked also showed the highest concentration of those unexplained straight-line markings left in the soil after the ground had closed. And those markings were beginning to tell a story of their own. Scripture addresses the relationship between animals and divine communication with a directness that is easy to overlook. Job chapter 12, verses 7 and 8 record these words: "Ask the animals, and they will teach you. Speak to the earth, and it will teach you." That instruction is not poetic decoration. It is a practical directive. It suggests that the created world communicates in a language that precedes human language, that animals perceive and respond to realities that human senses and human instruments arrive at later, if at all. What was being observed across America was consistent with that framework. The animals were not panicking. They were not fleeing in terror. They were doing something far more specific. They were signaling caution in places where human assessment had already declared safety. And in every instance where animal caution was highest, the same discovery eventually followed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but consistently. The ground in those exact locations would later reveal something unexpected, something that had been there the entire time, just waiting to be uncovered. Think about what it means when an animal refuses to cross a boundary that humans cannot see. It means the animal has access to information the human does not. It means the environment is communicating on a frequency that bypasses human perception entirely. For communities trying to recover, for families trying to rebuild, for officials trying to declare areas safe and move on. That reality is profoundly uncomfortable because it means the all-clear signal came from instruments. But the warning signal was still coming from creation itself. And the two signals were pointing in opposite directions. While farmers and wildlife researchers struggled to reconcile what they were seeing, attention was being drawn upward, because the sky over the American Midwest was doing something that had no category in standard meteorological records, something that thousands of people witnessed, something that moved without wind, rotated without storm, and disappeared without explanation. It appeared in the afternoon, over open grassland in the Midwest. A ring of dark clouds forming high above the plains, wide, circular, and rotating. Below it, the grass stood completely still. Not a single blade of grass moved. But directly above, a massive cloud was turning in a slow, steady loop. Two completely different atmospheric realities existing in the same column of air. And meteorologists had no immediate explanation for how that was physically possible. Plus, people who witnessed the formation described the same detail repeatedly and independently. The clouds were clearly moving. There was visible rotation. A darker core at the center, surrounded by lighter cloud material circling it in a continuous loop. But the air at ground level was completely calm. No wind, no temperature change, no pressure drop, no moisture increase. None of the atmospheric indicators that typically precede or accompany rotating cloud systems were present at ground level. The phenomenon existed above, entirely contained, entirely isolated from the environment below it. What unsettled meteorologists most was not the rotation. Rotating cloud formations are documented. What unsettled them was the containment. And the formation did not spread, did not intensify, did not produce any of the downstream effects that rotating cloud systems almost universally produce. It simply rotated, held its shape, and waited. Witnesses who had seen tornadoes described how different this felt. Tornadoes announce themselves. There is atmospheric pressure. Sound builds. The air takes on a quality that experienced storm observers describe as electric. This had none of that. The sky above was active. The ground below was peaceful. And the contrast between those two realities created a stillness that witnesses described as heavier than silence, as if the normal rules connecting sky to ground had been temporarily suspended. Several witnesses reported that birds in the area below the formation continued flying normally for several minutes before anything changed. Then, without any visible trigger, every bird in the vicinity stopped mid-flight pattern, regrouped, and moved away from the area directly beneath the formation, leaving the sky below it completely empty. The formation held for an extended period, long enough that people had time to call others, long enough that groups gathered to watch, long enough that the initial assumption that it would dissipate quickly like unusual cloud formations typically do was replaced by a growing uncertainty. And then, gradually, it began to thin, not collapse, not dissolve in the typical way of cloud formations breaking apart. It thinned, became translucent, and faded, as if it had completed something. Researchers who analyzed available footage noted one detail that did not appear in initial reports. In the final moments before the formation disappeared, the rotation slowed measurably, not stopped suddenly, slowed deliberately. The way a machine slows when it has finished its function, not the way weather dissipates. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, speaks of signs appearing in the heavens, not as final declarations, not as the end of something, but as moments designed to interrupt routine, to cause people to lift their eyes from the ground and pay attention to what is happening above them. The language used is deliberate. Signs, not storms, not disasters. Signs. A sign is communication directed at a specific audience. A sign carries meaning beyond its physical form. A sign exists not to destroy, but to inform. What made the Midwest cloud formation impossible to fully dismiss was what happened in the same geographic region in the 48 hours that followed, as if the sky had been marking a location, drawing attention to a specific area, and the ground beneath that area was about to make its own announcement. Weather science can explain rotating cloud formations under the right conditions. Differential wind speeds at different altitudes, temperature layer inversions, local circulation patterns created by terrain. These explanations exist, and they are legitimate, but they require conditions that were not present on that day in that location. The atmosphere was not set up for what occurred, and the behavior of the formation after it appeared did not follow the patterns those explanations would predict. This is the gap, not between science and faith, between what was expected and what occurred. That gap kept widening, because as the cloud formation faded over the Midwest, reports began arriving from the opposite side of the country, from a coastline, from water, from something ancient rising to the surface of the ocean that had not been seen in living memory. And what it looked like when it arrived made researchers question everything they thought they knew about what was buried beneath American soil. It happened without warning, as it always does. A stretch of road in a residential area, certified stable. Inspected recently. No underground water issues flagged. No structural concerns noted. And then the surface was gone. Not cracked, not damaged, gone. A section of road that had existed for decades simply was no longer there. In its place, a hole, dark, deep, and perfectly silent. No one was injured in the initial collapse, but what emergency crews found when they assessed the site made the absence of injury feel less like luck and more like intention. Well, because what was beneath that road had clearly been there for a very long time, and something had only recently changed to make the surface above it fail. Sinkholes are not new to America. Florida has documented them for decades. Parts of the Midwest and Southeast sit above limestone geology that is naturally prone to underground dissolution. Water moves through rock over centuries, creating voids. Eventually, those voids grow large enough that the surface above them collapses. This is understood. This is documented. This is science. But what began occurring across affected American regions in this period did not follow that pattern. The geological surveys of the sinkhole sites revealed something that experienced engineers described as inconsistent with standard formation processes. The voids beneath the collapsed surfaces were not the result of gradual water dissolution. They were too uniform, too sudden. And in several cases, they were aligned. 3 sinkholes. Different locations, different days. And when their positions were mapped, they formed a line. Not approximate, not roughly aligned. A straight line beneath the surface stretching across streets, open lots, and undeveloped land, as if something had drawn a boundary underground, and the surface above it was simply the last thing to receive the message. Before any barriers were set up, before officials arrived to close the areas, animals reacted. Dogs refused to walk within a certain distance of each sinkhole site. Not one dog, multiple dogs, belonging to different owners, in different households along the affected line, all of them stopping at approximately the same distance from the opening, as if the boundary underground was also broadcasting upward in a frequency only they could read. Residents described the silence before each collapse as the most unsettling detail. Not the collapse itself, the silence before it. No cracking sounds, no ground movement, no warning vibration. The surface gave no indication, and then it withdrew. That word matters. Withdrew. Not collapsed under pressure, not failed under load. Withdrew, as if the ground made a choice. Engineers brought in to assess the aligned sinkholes submitted their reports. Those reports contained a phrase that circulated quietly among structural geology circles afterward. No conventional formation mechanism identified, which is the professional way of saying, we don't know why this happened here, in this pattern, at this time. Scripture does not treat the ground as passive. Throughout the oldest texts, the earth is described as responsive, not geological, responsive. Numbers chapter 16 describes ground opening beneath specific people at a specific moment as an act of judgment rather than random geology. Isaiah chapter 24 describes the earth reeling and staggering under the weight of what has passed over it. Psalm 18 describes the earth shaking and quaking as a response to divine movement. In every case, the ground is not the cause, it is the responder. Something moves through it, and the earth records that movement, which brings the aligned sinkholes back into focus. Because if the ground is capable of responding rather than simply failing, then the question is not what geological process created the line beneath those 3 locations. The question is, what passed through them, and when? After the initial sinkholes were cordoned off and assessed, The surrounding areas were monitored closely. Instruments were placed. Surveillance was increased. Officials expected either further collapse or stabilization. What they got was neither. The ground held. No further collapses occurred. No spreading damage. No chain reaction. As if whatever had caused the openings had accomplished exactly what it came to do. And then stopped, precisely, deliberately, done. The precision of the stopping was almost more troubling than the collapses themselves, because random geological failure doesn't stop precisely. It continues until equilibrium is reached. This stopped at a specific point, which suggested it was operating toward a specific outcome. Not chaos, something measured. Communities living near the affected areas asked straightforward questions. Are more sinkholes coming? Is our ground safe? What caused this? Officials gave the only answers available to them. We are monitoring. We have found no evidence of imminent further collapse. Investigation is ongoing, which translated in plain language to, we do not fully understand what happened. We do not know if it is finished, and we cannot promise it will not happen again. For families living on that street, for communities built on similar geology, for a nation watching from a distance, that answer, honest as it was, opened something else. A different kind of void, not in the ground, in the confidence that the ground beneath ordinary American life is as stable as it has always been assumed to be, and that confidence, once opened, does not close easily. The sinkholes were visible. They could be photographed, cordoned off. I explained to some degree, even if not fully. They had edges, a defined perimeter, a measurable depth. What was happening elsewhere had none of those qualities. In Alaska, something was surfacing from beneath the ocean floor that had no edges, no perimeter, no measurable beginning. Something ancient. Something that had been sealed beneath frozen ground for longer than recorded American history. And it was coming up. What researchers found on Alaska's coastline didn't look like a spill. It didn't look like contamination. It looked like the ocean floor was exhaling, releasing something it had held for centuries. And the implications of that release extended far beyond Alaska's shoreline. It appeared on the ice first, dark against white, unmistakable. Along stretches of Alaska's remote coastline, a thick black substance began surfacing on frozen shores, not spreading from a central point, not moving with ocean currents, emerging from multiple locations simultaneously. As if being pushed upward from below, Coast Guard vessels were dispatched, environmental agencies were notified. The first assumption was industrial, a tanker, a pipeline, a platform. But the investigation that followed ruled out every modern source within the first 48 hours, which left a question that took far longer to answer. If nothing modern produced this, what did? The substance tested as organic, biological in origin, ancient in composition. Researchers tracing its origin pointed downward, not to surface water, not to ocean currents, downward, to layers of organic material buried beneath Alaska's coastal seafloor, layers that had been accumulating and compressing for thousands of years, sealed beneath permafrost and sediment, locked in place by pressure and cold. Until now, the geological explanation involved shifting pressure beneath the seafloor, thawing permafrost, a subtle ground movement creating fractures in ancient sediment layers. But those explanations raised a follow-up question that the geological framework alone could not answer. Why now? These pressure conditions had been building for decades. What changed? What finally gave way? Permafrost is exactly what it sounds like. Ground that stays frozen, permanently, or what was once considered permanently. Beneath Alaska's coastal regions, permafrost layers extend hundreds of feet downward. But within those layers, organic material from ancient ecosystems is preserved. Plants, animals, biological matter from periods of Earth history that predate human civilization in the Americas. As those permafrost layers shift and thaw, the organic material they contain begins to decompress, to move, to find pathways upward through fractured rock and sediment. And what arrives at the surface is not new material. It is ancient material, released into a modern world that has no reference point for receiving it. Scientists measuring the age of the surfacing material in some Alaska locations dated it to several thousand years before present, meaning what was washing onto those frozen shores had last been exposed to open air before the earliest recorded civilizations. It had been sealed since before written history began, and something had just broken that seal. The book of Job, chapter 28, verse 11, records this phrase: "When he dams up the streams from trickling, what is hidden he brings out to light." The emphasis in that passage is not on destruction, it is on revelation. What was contained becomes uncontained. What was hidden becomes visible, not through human discovery, through the failure of containment itself. That framing applied directly to what was surfacing in Alaska. This was not science finding something. This was something finding its way out. Environmental researchers noted that the locations where the ancient material was surfacing corresponded to areas where permafrost degradation had accelerated most significantly in recent years. But degradation had been occurring in those areas for some time. The surfacing was new, which meant the degradation had finally crossed a threshold. And crossing a threshold is different from gradual change. Crossing a threshold means something has ended, and something else has begun. For communities along Alaska's coastline, the practical concerns were immediate. What is this substance? Is it toxic? Is it spreading? What does it mean for fishing, for water, for wildlife in the region? Environmental assessments suggested the material itself posed limited immediate toxicity risk. It was organic, ancient, not industrial contamination in the conventional sense, but the process producing it was concerning. Because if ancient sealed layers were fracturing enough to release this material at the surface, what else was those same layers containing? Methane, carbon dioxide, gases trapped in permafrost for millennia that carry significant atmospheric implications when released at scale. Researchers who study permafrost gas release describe a concept called runaway feedback, a point at which thawing releases gases that accelerate warming, which accelerates thawing, which releases more gases. A self-reinforcing cycle with no natural break once it reaches sufficient scale. The question Alaska's coastline was raising was uncomfortable. Was this event a data point in a slow process? Or was it a signal that the threshold for that feedback had already been crossed? That question has no clean answer yet. Science is measuring. Data is accumulating. Models are being revised. But while the scientific process works at its careful pace, the ancient sealed material continues to appear on Alaskan shores, quietly, without urgency, without announcement, just presence. The presence of something that was not supposed to be here, not in this time, not on this surface. Something that belonged to a different era of the Earth's history, now returned. While Alaska was releasing what it had stored in ancient frozen layers, something almost exactly opposite was occurring beneath Florida. Not releasing upward, revealing downward. Spaces of enormous size had existed beneath one of America's most populated states for thousands of years, and the ground above them had just run out of the strength to keep them secret. Florida sits on limestone, millions of acres of it, extending deep beneath the peninsula's surface, and limestone dissolves. Water moves through it over centuries, carving channels, creating voids, building hollow spaces beneath the surface that bear the weight of everything above them. Roads, buildings, neighborhoods, entire cities, all of it resting on a foundation that is, in places, hollow. That fact has been known for decades. Florida's sinkhole risk is documented, mapped, and factored into insurance policies across the state. What was not known, what recent ground failures have begun to reveal, is the scale of what exists beneath the surface, because the maps were wrong, significantly wrong. And the discoveries being forced into view by collapsing ground are rewriting what researchers thought they understood about Florida's underground geography. In several locations across the state, ground failures that appeared initially to be standard sinkholes opened into something far larger. The standard expectation for a sinkhole is a void of measurable but limited scale, tens of feet in diameter, perhaps 100 feet deep in severe cases. What was found beneath these new collapse points was different. Chamber systems, interconnected spaces, rooms of natural formation extending far beyond the collapse point in multiple directions, vast hollow worlds that had existed beneath Florida's surface for thousands of years, unknown, unmapped, completely unseen until the ceiling above them gave way. The discovery that troubled researchers most was not the size of the chambers. It was the evidence of what had moved through them. Ancient water channels, sediment deposits from periods thousands of years in the past, evidence that these systems had been actively processing water and material from the surface for millennia, beneath communities, beneath infrastructure, beneath everything, silently, continuously, invisibly. Geological surveys commissioned after the discoveries revised estimates of Florida's underground void distribution significantly upward. The previous maps, the ones used to assess building risk, issue development permits, designate safe zones, were based on incomplete data. That is the professional language, incomplete data. What it means in practical terms is that large sections of Florida's underground geography were simply unknown, and the ground had been bearing the weight of modern development above spaces that no assessment had ever identified. Insurance companies began requesting updated geological surveys. Municipal governments began reassessing infrastructure risk. And in quiet conversations between engineers and planners, a question was being asked that no one wanted to say publicly. How much of what we have built is sitting above ground we do not fully understand? The book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 22, records these words. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness. The emphasis is specific, not human discovery, not scientific advancement, revelation. Things emerging from darkness not because humans searched harder, but because the time for concealment had ended. What was being uncovered beneath Florida fit that framework precisely. These chambers had not been found by improved technology. They had not been identified by more sophisticated scanning. They had been revealed by collapse, by the failure of the surface to continue concealing what existed below it. And in that detailed revelation through failure rather than discovery through effort, a pattern was completing itself. Because across every event documented in this sequence, the mechanism was the same. Not dramatic destruction, not catastrophic announcement. Quiet exposure. Things that had been hidden simply becoming visible, as if concealment itself was the thing that was ending. Florida residents living near collapse sites asked a question that no geological survey could fully answer. Oh, is my home safe? The honest answer required acknowledging that the ground beneath any given location in Florida may contain voids that no current mapping has identified. That structural integrity assumed based on surface assessment may not account for what exists below. That the foundation everyone is standing on may be more complex and less stable than any visible evidence suggests. That answer is not alarmist. It is simply accurate. There is a word that kept appearing in the reports filed by geological teams assessing the Florida discoveries. The word was not unstable, it was not dangerous. The word was unknown. And in the context of ground you are living on, building on, raising families on, unknown may be the most unsettling word of all. Throughout human history, civilizations have built on ground they believed they understood. Egypt built on desert. Rome built on hills. America built on everything. plains, coastlines, floodplains, limestone peninsulas with unknown voids extending in every direction beneath the surface. The assumption in each case was the same. The ground is solid enough. The ground has held before. The ground will continue to hold. But beneath Florida, the ground had been holding something far larger than anyone knew, and the effort of that holding thousands of years of bearing weight above hidden hollow spaces had finally begun to show. Not everywhere, not catastrophically, but consistently, persistently, in a pattern that matched everything else that had been surfacing, literally and figuratively, across America in this period. At this point, a reasonable person asks a reasonable question. Is this just a bad season? A cluster of unrelated events that feel connected because they happened close together in time? That question deserves a serious answer, not a dismissal, not an assumption. A serious, direct answer. So here it is. Random clustering of events is a documented phenomenon. It has a name in statistics. Coincidence. And coincidence is real, but coincidence has characteristics. Random events cluster without pattern, without escalation, without sequence, without the kind of internal logic that makes each event feel like a response to the one before it. What has been documented across America in this period does not have the characteristics of random clustering. It has the characteristics of something else entirely. Something that ancient literature described with striking precision thousands of years before any of these events occurred. And the description is specific enough to be uncomfortable. The biblical framework for understanding national-level signs operates on a clear logic. It is not random. It is not punitive without warning. It follows a sequence that the prophetic books describe consistently. First, disruption of the expected. Things that should work in familiar ways stop working that way. Weather behaves unusually. Timing breaks down. The normal patterns that communities depend on become unreliable. This matches the misplaced rain exactly. Not destruction. Disruption of the expected. Stage 1 in the biblical pattern is not fire and judgment. It is confusion. The reliable becomes unreliable. The familiar becomes strange. And the purpose of that confusion is specific. It is designed to create pause, to interrupt the momentum of a society that has stopped asking foundational questions. The rain from clear skies was not an end. It was an opening. Second in the sequence comes communication through creation, not through human voices, not through institutional channels, through the earth itself, through the sky, through the behavior of animals. In Amos chapter 4, the escalating signs are described in order: famine, drought, crop failure, disease, military defeat, and each stage more direct than the last, each stage followed by the same refrain: "Yet you did not return to me." The escalation exists because the purpose is not destruction. The purpose is return. And if an early signal does not produce return, the next signal arrives, more direct, more difficult to explain away, more personal in its impact. This is the detail most people miss when they read the prophetic books. The escalation is not evidence of anger increasing. It is evidence of communication intensifying. A teacher does not increase the difficulty of a lesson because they are frustrated. They increase it because the earlier lesson was not absorbed. The signs across America were not getting louder by accident. Third in the sequence is the response of creation at a level beneath human activity. The earth itself demonstrating instability. The sky presenting signs that cannot be fully categorized. The ground revealing what it has been concealing. Ancient things surfacing. Hidden things becoming visible. Job, chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. Ask the animals, and they will teach you, or the birds in the sky, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish in the sea inform you. Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind. the animals refusing familiar paths, the birds altering flight patterns, the ground opening in straight lines, ancient material surfacing from sealed layers. Each of these is addressed directly in that passage, not as poetic metaphor, as literal communication from creation to the creatures within it. The consistency between what ancient scripture describes as the pattern of divine communication through creation and what has been documented across America in this period is not vague. It is not a matter of squinting at history and forcing a match. The categories line up directly: disruption of the expected, communication through creation, ground revelation, sky signs, and then the stage most people in America are not yet discussing. The one that follows all of these, what follows the creation signs in the biblical sequence, is a call to examination. Not external examination, internal. The question the prophetic books ask consistently at this stage is not what is happening in the sky. It is what is happening in the society beneath the sky. What has been normalized that should have remained unacceptable? What has been celebrated that should have remained concerning? What has been dismissed that deserved serious attention? America in 2024 and 2025 is a nation with genuine answers to those questions. And those answers are uncomfortable regardless of political perspective. The prophetic books do not frame national signs as punishment directed at individuals. They frame them as communication directed at a collective, at a nation, at a culture. The signs appear in the shared environment. The rain falls on everyone's fields. The ground opens beneath shared infrastructure. The sky above is visible to all, because the communication is addressed to all, not to the guilty specifically, to the nation collectively. Isaiah chapter 24 describes what a society under this kind of communication looks like from the outside. The earth is broken up. Oh, the earth is split asunder. The earth is violently shaken. The earth reels like a drunkard. It sways like a hut in the wind, reeling, swaying, not destroyed, destabilized. A hut in the wind is not demolished. It shakes, it strains. It reminds its occupants that the structure they are sheltering in is not as solid as they have been assuming. That is the precise quality of what has been occurring across America, not catastrophe, destabilization. And destabilization in the biblical framework has a specific purpose. It is not designed to destroy the structure. It is designed to make the occupants of the structure ask whether they want to rebuild it stronger or simply wait for the next shake. That question, rebuild or wait, is the question America is standing inside right now, and the answer being given collectively will determine what comes next in the sequence. Luke chapter 21, verses 25 and 26 describe the atmosphere of a society receiving these kinds of signs. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world. Perplexity, anguish, not because people don't see what's happening, because they see it clearly and cannot agree on what it means. That is a description of America today with striking accuracy. The events are visible, the footage exists, the data is real. The disagreement is not about whether the events occurred. It is about what they mean. And that disagreement, that inability to agree on the meaning of visible events, is itself part of the pattern. Because a society that cannot read its own signs is a society that is not yet at the stage of response. It is still at the stage of argument. And in the biblical sequence, as long as argument replaces response, the signals do not stop, they intensify. Which means what has been documented so far may not be the peak of the sequence. It may be closer to the beginning. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It was not designed to be. Comfort is not the function of a warning. The function of a warning is to create enough discomfort to motivate a change in direction before the consequences of the current direction arrive in full. A smoke detector is not pleasant. It is not designed to be. It is designed to wake you up before the fire reaches the room you are sleeping in. The question the biblical pattern asks at this stage is simple. Is America awake? The honest answer to that question requires looking at one final set of events. Events that have been occurring not at the edges of American society, but at its center, in its foundations, in the systems and structures that the nation's daily function depends on. Because if the outer signs, weather, ground, animals, sky, are the smoke detector, then what is happening to the foundations is the smoke itself. And it has been visible for longer than most people have been willing to acknowledge. The biblical pattern does not end with signs. It ends with one of two outcomes: return or continuation. Return means a society collectively examining what it has normalized, acknowledging what has drifted, making choices that reflect the values that produced its strength, rather than the habits that are eroding it. Continuation means the signals increase in directness until they can no longer be framed as weather events or geological anomalies or atmospheric curiosities. Until they become undeniable, until explanation is no longer possible, until the only remaining question is response. Every society that has ever faced this sequence in recorded history has stood at exactly this point. The point where the signs are visible enough to be undeniable, but early enough that response is still possible. History records what happened next in each case, and the pattern of those outcomes is the most important data set available to America right now. But that data points toward something that most people have not yet connected to the current events, something that changes the entire framing of what these signs are asking. There is one final piece, one element of this sequence that has not been addressed yet. Not because it is less important, because it is the most important, and it requires everything that came before it to be properly understood. Every sign documented in this period has a geographic component. The rain fell in specific places. The ground opened in a line. The ancient material surfaced at specific coastal points. The caves were found beneath a specific state. Location matters in the biblical framework. Signs do not appear randomly across the globe. They appear where the communication is directed. And when the locations of all the major anomalies documented across America in this period are mapped together, the sinkhole lines, the animal behavior corridors, the underground sound zones, the permafrost fracture points, they form something. Not chaos, not random scatter, a pattern with a shape. And that shape corresponds to something in American geography that researchers have not yet publicly connected to these events. This is the part that changes everything, because signs without location are general. Signs with location are specific, and specific signs are addressed to specific recipients. The history of prophetic communication in Scripture is full of location-specific signals. Jonah was sent to Nineveh, not to the whole ancient world, to Nineveh specifically, because Nineveh specifically was at the point in its sequence where the communication was required. The message to Nineveh was not complicated. It was not theological. It was direct. You have 40 days. What you do in those 40 days determines what comes next. Nineveh responded, the entire city, from its leadership to its population. They stopped. They examined, they changed direction, and the outcome that had been announced was suspended, not permanently, suspended, because response changes sequence. This is the mechanism the prophetic framework operates on, and it means the sequence currently unfolding across America is not fixed. It is not predetermined toward a single outcome. It is responsive to what America does next. What America does next. That phrase carries more weight right now than almost any political statement, any economic forecast, any cultural analysis. Because the signs have been appearing. The sequence has been unfolding. The pattern matches ancient description with uncomfortable precision. And the question is no longer whether the signs are real. The question is whether the people receiving them understand what kind of signs they are. Warning signs exist to prevent an outcome, not to announce one. Which means the most important thing about everything documented in this video is not what has already happened. It is what has not happened yet. Because if the biblical pattern holds, and history suggests it does, what comes after unheeded signs is not more signs. What comes after unheeded signs is the thing the signs were warning about. And there is one event, one specific category of event, that appears at the end of every escalating prophetic sequence in Scripture, without exception. An event that has not yet occurred in America, but that the current sequence is pointing toward with increasing directness. The ground has opened, the sky has moved, the ancient has surfaced, the hidden has been revealed. The animals have stopped at lines humans cannot see. All of it visible, all of it documented. All of it fitting a framework written thousands of years ago. And still the question remains unanswered. Not what is happening, but what happens next. What the biblical sequence points to after these signs? What history records following this exact pattern? What America has not yet experienced, but what every piece of evidence in this sequence suggests is approaching. That answer exists. It is documented. It is specific. And it begins in a place no one has been looking. Not in the sky. And not in the ground. In the one institution that has been present at the center of every major national turning point in American history. An institution that is itself currently showing the same signs of hidden instability that preceded every other collapse documented in this video. The surface looks normal. The reports say stable. But underneath, something has already changed. And the moment that change reaches the surface, everything else accelerates. What that institution is, what the change beneath it looks like, and what history says comes next. That is a conversation that cannot wait much longer, because the sequence does not pause. It does not wait for convenient timing. It does not slow down while people decide whether to pay attention. It simply continues to the next stage, already in motion, already arriving, already here,